Welcome to Psychedelic Seminars. I'm Mike Margulies, founder of PsychSems and host here today. And I'm here with my friend Taylor.
Hi, everybody.
So, I guess one thing we could start with is, Taylor, would you like to share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. First of all, I want to say hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Taylor. I'm a therapist and psychedelic guide working here in Northern California. I come from about a decade background as a union organizer, progressive advocate, progressive organizer in a lot of different movements here in California and across the United States. And I'm excited to be here. Oh, I guess one thing that's worth naming is, as someone who's working in the underground here in California, I, like many people, am connected to the larger psychedelic community, which is, of course, connected to Aharon Grossbard, who is the topic of the article that kind of inspired this conversation today. So I won't go into much more detail, but worth naming that, like many practitioners, I too am a part of that larger web.
Yeah, and I guess I'll also, in the similar vein, give the disclosure. Francois is a friend of mine who I've collaborated with previously. Some of you may have seen the Weaving Worlds episode that we put out about a year ago. I don't personally know Aharon, and I have not, checked in with Francois about doing this particular episode here. So everything that is coming here today from me is, my own perspective, informed by other folks in community that I've been in conversation with. But just in the interest of disclosures and everything here. But yeah, why don't we ground this thing first? Like, why are we here? Why are we here today? So I think that the origin of this event is we got coffee together, actually. About a week ago.
Yeah, like maybe 5 days ago.
5 days ago. And this is just sort of in the field right now. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about this. And, one thing I'll say is that I really appreciated some of the ways that you were articulating what was going on. And I was just thinking, and simultaneously, I had been sitting with this for some time. I had been asked by several people in the community, what do I think about this? And for a while I was declining because I was still processing all of this. And yeah, I appreciated the things you said that we'll get into a little bit here. And I have a desire myself to, I'm not a psychedelic therapist or guide. I'm not an expert on the ethics of this situation. But one thing that I have thought about a lot is how to hold nuanced conversations. Mm-hmm. And I think it's something it's a muscle that is good to exercise. And it's something that, not just with this situation, but just generally culturally, it's not something that I think we do very well, to hold kind of complexity and paradox and hold these things together. And so wanted to make an attempt at that kind of a level of conversation here. Mm-hmm. We might make mistakes. We probably will. But yeah. And so, thank you for your patience, everyone, if we fuck up.
I want to jump in and say, it's possible some of you in the audience don't know what we're talking about. Maybe you just actually saw this event and decided to join because you care about psychedelic ethics. Mike, is the article somewhere in Discord that people can read?
Yes. So there is a specific event that happened or that is a spark of all this. So yeah, in the ethics channel of this Discord server, if you scroll all the way to the top, the source articles speaking to what happened are on, and we're going to touch on it a bit here too. But if folks who want, we're not going to recap the entire thing though. So if folks who want the full context, the source articles, the original articles are on the top of that, as well as the responses. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, and we'll give a little bit of, we'll get into that too. Mm-hmm. Maybe one thing, well, before we get into that, I wanted to ask, do you have other things you would like to share about, why are we here? Why are you here? Yeah, why do you want to have this conversation with me on the internet right now?
Totally. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, so So when these articles came out, which was about 2 weeks ago now, perhaps, I was witnessing a lot of the responses that were happening online and across different types of listservs. And one of the patterns that I saw was people responding from a place of trying to get that bad thing as far away from us as possible. And also trying to create kind of structural changes and structural supports for how this could never happen that, in my opinion, kind of completely misses the point of why things like ethical violations happen. So I saw a lot of people being like, oh, we should record every psychedelic session ever. Or people being like, husband and wife therapy teams should never work together. Or even people who are friends should never work together as therapy teams. And to me, that felt and still feels like this kind of knee-jerk structural response to protect us from ever having to encounter ourselves and grapple with our own, like, why does this happen? And how do people fall so poorly out of attunement and fall so poorly out of the role of care and the role of help that they step into? And so I just saw a lot of this response. And so when you and I had that conversation, I feel like I had a lot to say. And I think it's really important as people in the helping profession and also as people who, just want to be working towards and building towards a more just and liberated future, that we don't just push away people or things that we think are causing harm, but that we actually look at them and actually look at ourselves and what in ourselves is that activating, and where could I too do that? Because I personally don't believe that I am so much different from anyone else who might cause harm. And I don't just believe, and so there's something there. There's something in that kind of teasing out and talking about it from a more, I don't know if calm is the right word, but just talking about it more, that I was interested in, which is why I said yes to this.
Yeah, and I want to echo some of that. I've certainly caused harm in my life, right? And we all have. So there is this, how do we engage with our own shadow, I think, is a really important question here. And where do we see ourselves in all of this situation? And versus instead of pushing things away, how do we really engage in a very difficult way with aspects of even ourselves that we don't want to look at?
Yeah, and something that I want to just add there is, and this is my first time articulating this, so thank you everyone for your forgiveness. It feels like, especially as I'm assuming many of us here are part of helping professions, or activists or people working for DCRIM or whatever, the way that we engage with people in power who are doing harm, to me, it feels like it might mirror the way that we engage with people who really need help that are doing harm. And I say that because as a therapist, I have worked with people who have murdered people, who have stolen, who've spent a lot of time being impacted by the systems of incarceration in this country, who have really caused a lot of harm. And so when I'm sitting across from someone who's killed someone, I too, in that situation, know that I am not somehow fundamentally morally different from them, that if I was in that situation, I would have done the same thing. And so for me, it's also a call to how can those of us who are in these professions or in these callings, or are just people who believe that people are not the worst things they've ever done, how can we continue to expand our capacity to bring that when something like this happens, when it's a beloved elder, when it's a beloved teacher, as it always is, and it happens all the time. This is not a unique situation. So I want to just name that piece also.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think it's obviously this is obvious, but it's worth naming also. This is not to say that, it's just okay to murder and abuse and all this, right? Obviously not. We need to figure out, I think a question is, how do we hold accountability and compassion at the same time? Mm-hmm. And what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And that's not an easy question to answer. This is some of some framing, I think, of what we're going to get into. Maybe an ask I would make of our audience here, though, is, I'll let you share if this feels right for you too, but I know for me, I feel very vulnerable having this conversation. It took me a while to even want to address this, to even broach this. It feels like kind of like walking over in a landmine. You say the wrong thing and it's going to be, I would appreciate some patience. And if we say something, I also feedback, let's model a process, let's say, that we would like to see. So I do invite feedback. If people have thoughts, reflections on this, I'd love to hear them. I'm sure we'll get plenty. But yeah, so thanks for letting us be vulnerable with you here.
Yeah, I feel that as well. I mean, I obviously chose to use a fake name. So I do feel like a certain level of protection within that. But of course, that's also, a random piece of protection that is there or isn't. And yeah, and just wanting to name that I really am holding and feeling the delicacy of what it means to hold accountability within a criminalized workforce. There's so much that's so delicate and tender and scary for people there. Yeah, and this feels like, and especially I think for many of us in the underground psychedelic movement who hold identities of privilege and power, which there are a lot of members of the psychedelic underground that hold identities of privilege and power. To me, it's calling forth a question of like, how can I not let this kind of random fear that isn't actually based on my risk level stop us from having conversations that we really need to have? And how can we be using that actually pretty real, it's not universal, but that pretty real safety, especially those of us who live in places where decrim is real or where there's a long culture of this. So how can we have conversations that are necessary and not let this kind of false fear push us back from taking stances that we know are true? In the vein of kind of naming vulnerability, and also just things that I want to preface, is I really want to name the things that I'm sharing here, and some of them are me and my own brilliance, but a lot of the things that I'm sharing are deeply informed by teachers and community members and colleagues from a lot of different places, many and most of whom, in terms of my formative thinking around just how to imagine expanding my capacity for thought and imagining into a better world, are women and queer people of color. And so I really want to name that a lot of the capacity to imagine that I feel that I have, that I work towards, is from a legacy of thinking. And I just want to put that here. Yeah.
We certainly stand on the shoulders of giants, and of many people. And the same goes for me. I have my own ideas, and they're very much drawing from conversations with many people, things I've read, things I've watched. And so yeah, I think that's some good context setting.
Yeah.
Feel good?
Feel good.
Cool. Well, maybe we should just get into the thing. Okay. So what happened exactly? What happened? What was the spark of this situation? Would you want to?
Yeah, I can share a brief recap. And again, I'm just going to give a pitch for people to go. The articles are long, and there's a lot there. And I think that more information is more information. And so I encourage folks to read it if you want to. But basically, a couple of weeks ago, a very brave person named Will Hall published a blog post article that went forward in variations on Medium and on a blog called Mad in America, talking broadly about ethical violations and abuse in therapy, and specifically in psychedelic therapy, and specifically naming some experiences of violation and feelings of abuse in their relationship with Aharon Grossbard. That's really kind of the top line of it. And again, there's a lot in there, and it speaks to a lot of different things. I'll say that one of the kind of really important aspects of it that to me feels like the most relevant pieces for us to talk about here, and we're going to be talking about them, I hope, less about Aharon specifically and like what he did do and what he didn't do, and more broadly about how can we look at this as themes of things that are happening in the psychedelic movement and therapy all the time, whether we like acknowledging that or not. But, you know, those things include some specific types of holds that Will says Aharon did, specifically a front-facing forward hold where there was clothed genital-to-genital contact, and then also some kind of boundary violations around the ways that Will was maybe integrated into some parts of Aharon and Francois's life that are different than normal standard therapy kind of ethical codes outline as okay.
Yeah, and do we want to go into any of like the specifics that, you know, well, yeah, I mean, like I think there was in Will's story, there was a paragraph in particular, right, that really epitomized where the initial like real harm happened. And I'm going to try to represent Will's story as best I can. Feel free to like chime in, but
sure.
Yeah, so there was a situation where Will said to Aharon something to the effect of, I want to be held, but I don't know how. Aharon brought him into this position, the one you named, where they're facing each other, you know, genital to genitals, clothes on, kind of, I guess, in Aharon's lap. And it was at this point in time that Will said, hey, this feels sexual. And the gist I've gotten from that story was that Aharon said, no, it's not. This is nurturing. And yeah, and feel free to jump in wherever you're here. That seems to be the point where where the harm was caused, right? And if we assume here that, okay, let's assume Aharon was genuinely trying to provide a nurturing touch. Even if that's the case, if the client then says, hey, this isn't something I want right now, right? The response, he didn't get the response of saying, oh, I'm sorry, you know, I'm stopping. I hear you. Wasn't my intention. I understand this is how it impacted you, and I'm stopping. Let's talk about it. Let's, you know, that's kind of my take on what happened there. I wasn't there, obviously, in the room, but that seems to be like the critical point where it happened. I don't know if you wanted to share any more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, to me, this, like, I want to say, like, sure, maybe that's where the harm was happened. I think that both of us, and as you just said, like, neither of us were there, neither of us really know what each person's experience was. But I think that there's a lot of entry points in this kind of scenario to go into. Like, there's this hold that would be totally out of bounds in a traditional therapeutic context, right? There's the feedback process by which a client says, hey, this isn't working for me. And then what does the therapist do? Which kind of rubs up against a lot of different orientations towards therapy, where it's like, is the client a patient or are they a client? Are they enacting their whatever attachment trauma and are saying something weird, or are they being sovereign and giving a clear boundary? And I think that there's actually a much wider diversity of therapeutic orientations where someone might interpret that and then we would like to recognize. And I also think that, you know, I don't know how Aharon was orienting at that time. I don't know that we need to necessarily focus in on that. But it does feel like there are all of these different kind of theories and orientations towards the work and ethical systems that like bubble up into this mess of confusion that I think is probably a mess of confusion that a lot of people who are working in the underground with different types of training that are not necessarily integrated experience confusion around and make mistakes around.
Yeah, and there's a lot here, right? Because psychedelic therapy is this just kind of mashup of different things, right? So, I mean, just regular therapy without psychedelics, right? There's a power dynamic that's just in the room.
Absolutely.
So that's just, okay, baseline. We've got power dynamics happening right now. Now, on top of that, let's add some touch, right? And I don't think, we can get more into this later, but I don't know that the answer is like no touch. A lot of traditional therapy, there isn't touch there, but in the tradition of psychedelic therapy, consensual touch can be very important.
Well, and I think that there, it's like in the tradition of psychedelic therapy is an interesting concept in and of itself, because what my understanding is some of the more recent lineages of this type of Western model of psychedelic therapy, which I think includes Salvador Arquette and other folks, like my most recent understanding is that they didn't include touch. Many indigenous traditions and intact traditions do include touch. I don't know if the reason that the Western forms of psychotherapy, and also, maybe I'm wrong about this, and if I'm wrong, someone correct me in the chat box. But if some of these more contemporary kind of fusion Western psychedelic traditions didn't include touch, is because of the woundings of kind of white dominant spaces and our total fear of touch and the body and our lack of understanding that so much of psyche lives in the body. So, when we talk about the tradition of psychedelic therapy, that also is complicated because there's intact traditions of many different kinds. There's all of these types of fusion traditions. And also I'm sure that there's many traditions in the underground that have been operating for decades that I don't know anything about and you don't know anything about.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So wherever these might have come from, I suppose maybe there are some psychedelic therapy traditions that don't involve this as well. Many do nowadays. Well, I guess the thing I was wanting to highlight in particular was that, okay, you've got power dynamics. Right. Now you also have touch, and we're going to throw some psychedelics on top of that. Right. Yeah. Right. So it's like this whole kind of a lot of ingredients that are together that certainly could lead to situations where, it's not, I don't want to, let me pause for a second here and gather my thoughts.
This is a spontaneous conversation, everyone.
Yeah. There's a lot of, within all of that, there's a lot that can go wrong, right? And without speaking about, I want to speak maybe more broadly than just the specifics of this situation, but I think just broadly, there's so much potential there when you're mixing the power dynamics and this touch and psychedelics.
Well, yes to that, and I don't want to detract from that particular mixture. There's a lot of risk. But I also don't want to, bypass the fact that, like, this harm happens in regular therapy where there's not supposed to be any touch or any expanded states. And, what percentage of therapists have sex with their clients? A huge percentage. Like, someone can look at the most recent issue of Camped, but it's, like, definitely above 10%. Of people that are reported. So that's like just the people that we know. And so what I think that this speaks to is actually that the power and importance of understanding erotic transference and countertransference supersedes modalities and is actually just something critical that we don't talk about enough with people who are holding space across modalities, including and especially in the psychedelic modalities, where, I know that in my specific training, we talked a little bit about it. I'm depth trained, so I talked constantly about that in my actual therapy training. But we do not talk about how to hold erotic space, and I think that it's a huge blind spot of the psychedelic community of what does it look like to actually engage eros more broadly, and then also to engage erotic energy specifically in a session when it arises, because we're engaging with people's humanity. And erotic energy for most people, and not saying in one way or another, for many people it's hard energy, for some people it's joyful, it's everything in between, but that's there when we're looking at what it means to be in a healing space. And I don't think that we talk about that enough, and I don't think that there's enough specific training. And I think that that is reflective of this larger cultural shadow where we, relegate sexuality to a corner. We demonize it when we see it in people. We project it onto certain bodies and pretend that other bodies are totally non-sexualized. And so to me, I think that is actually the much bigger thing to talk about, because this isn't just about okay, well, if you add psychedelics, yeah, people are more suggestible, there's a higher risk of harm. But this isn't just about a psychedelic container. This is about power, and this is about space holding in general.
Right. Yeah. Do you want to go deeper into that? This how to hold, and of course, there's other things we can say about the topic we've been on too, but maybe we should go into this while we're here.
Yeah, let's talk about it while we're here. I mean, so one thing that I'll say is I'm in community with a lot of psychedelic practitioners who are brilliant and incredible and who are all thinking really deeply about this. And when I let some of them know that I was doing this and was like, don't worry, I'm going to do my best. And is there anything that you want me to kind of try and talk about? And we were already planning on talking about this, but the thing that I got reflected back to me by several people was, we are afraid that incidents like this will push the issue of sexuality and sexuality in psychedelic therapy spaces even further into the shadows, making it even harder to talk about and thus causing even more harm. That was the message that I got from practitioners. Well, and because here's the thing, it's interesting, but it makes a lot of sense to me, because, in traditional therapy, there's a major boundary around touch. And even I would say that a lot of therapists, and caveat, there are incredible therapists and practitioners out there of all kinds, and many who are much better than me. So this is just one opinion, but I would say that a lot of therapists have a really hard time holding erotic energy, holding their clients' erotic energy, and holding their own erotic energy in a session. And I think that this is because, culturally speaking, so many people are not online with their bodies, and so many people have sexual trauma either from harm caused, or because we live in a repressed culture, or because their sexuality and sexual expression has been demonized in some way. And so what we arrive at there is a therapist, either above board or in a psychedelic context, in a session with a client, and either they're so detached from their sexual energy that when there's a current happening in the room with a client, they're totally unaware of it, or totally unwilling to be present to the reality that's there, which makes it come out sideways in this leaky way because they can't handle it. Or it is there and they feel it, but are so, I don't even know what this so is, but for whatever reason, they have this idea that if they feel a sexual or romantic connection with a client, that for some reason is so special and meaningful that supersedes the container that they've agreed into. And so again, this happens, and it happens for a lot of reasons, but I think that whatever this thing is about, what does it take for a practitioner and a space holder to be able to be in a room, to be in touch with the erotic energy that's there, and be so kind of grounded and in touch with themselves, which also I think means being kind of online with their sexual needs, whatever that is. Maybe they're asexual, maybe they're hypersexual, but online enough that they can know themselves enough and be resourced enough to be able to feel with honesty whatever is actually there in the room, but not have it impact their dedication to the container. To let the container and the client's well-being continue to be the most important thing, no matter what they're feeling and no matter what the client is feeling. Because I also understand, and this is where, it's all complicated, but this is one place where it gets complicated. Because oftentimes people in therapy really feel that they're in love with their therapist and they actually want to have sex with them, and maybe that's coming from a sovereign place. And as space holders, how can we kind of be with that and also recognize that what the container is asking for, and maybe there's some small percentage of cases where actually they're supposed to fall in love and that's the happily, maybe there's some small percent of cases where that's real, but I think that in the vast majority, probably 99% of cases, what is actually in service to the client who probably has spent a lot of their life having their sexuality disregarded or demonized or hypersexualized or whatever. So like the thing that actually is in service to the client the vast majority of the time is to not make their sexual desirability the most important thing about them by letting the container that's there for their healing be more important than your own desire to have sex with that person, which is like so simple and is like such foundational space holding. Like you're not supposed to have sex with the people that you're holding space for, right. But also is so complicated when you actually get down to like, what does it mean to do that not from a place of repression and from repressing the idea that you would ever be sexually attracted to a client, but actually from a place of being so in touch with yourself and your sexuality and your dedication to the container that the answer is clear every time, that it's not, that it's just like, oh, actually, like, great, whatever this thing is that I'm feeling, my role here is to be in service to this client's healing. And I know that 99.9 times me having sex with them and violating them in that way, even if with their words they say that that's what they want, is not in service to their healing.
Right. Yeah, so like, tell me if I'm kind of reflecting this right, but it's like acknowledging that feeling when it arises, not suppressing it, pretending it's not there, but not acting on it, right? But acting in service to the client. And I mean, this comes back to like the power dynamics ultimately is what this is about, right? Because in a normal situation, you're out in the world with your friends, feelings arise, like, okay, like you have the ability to act on things. Of course, rules of consent still apply. But in this container where there's a power dynamic, even if in that moment a client is saying, hey, I like, as expressing attraction, right? Even if it's mutually held in a moment, right? That power dynamic is there, and that's where like the responsibility comes on the therapist.
Yeah, and also the responsibility to I've been in different types of peer counseling communities, and I have this really vivid memory of one of my first peer counseling sessions many years ago. And because it's on the therapist or the space holder or the guide to understand that culturally we are really confused about the lines between intimacy and sexuality. And so often for so many people, and this happens a lot, but so often for so many people, when you're in this really intimate space with a therapist who's accepting everything about you and is like offering unconditional positive regard and is listening to you, and you're sharing things that maybe you haven't shared with people before, or you've never shared them with someone and actually gotten a good response because your family doesn't know how to listen to you or whatever, like it can get really confusing.
Yes.
And I remember in one of my first peer counseling sessions having this experience with this person that I was sharing all this stuff with and being met with this love and curiosity, and they were so interested in me. And I ended that session being like, oh my God, I love them. Like, I think I want to date them.
Right.
And then like 2 days later that dissipated, and I was like, whoa, that is really fascinating and really intense.
Yeah.
And, I speak to like older male therapists in my life who a lot of them share with me these experiences of men who identify as straight, kind of in this bewildered way expressing their sexual desire for them after sessions or after they've been working together. They're like, I'm so confused, but I'd like for some reason want to have sex with you.
Right.
And these older therapists in my life have really helped me understand, like, yeah, we have an intimacy problem in our culture. And this is one of the ways that it manifests is people are confused. Yeah. And when people feel intimacy, they often confuse that for sexual desire.
Right. And this is slightly tangential, but something that's coming up for me is, we're talking about like this confusion of roles and all of this, and like, I'm pausing here. It's like, I'm going to get a little bit more vulnerable. I'm going to do a personal sharing here. Like I'm thinking about an experience I had in my own psilocybin-assisted therapy session. And I remember there being moments of like, kind of like a confusion about role, because like, okay, now I'm in this psychedelic state and like, what even are the roles? What is that even? Aren't we just humans here? And I'm feeling, and so like that's a thing. Yeah. But again, this is where we're talking about with the power dynamics and everything, this is where it falls on like the person holding that space to really make sure they're showing up in service. And yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing maybe I'll just go into it. So I had an experience that really does inform some of my own perspectives on this situation. And what I'll say at the front of this is I think that in the situation that I experienced, the person I was working with, I think modeled the type of behavior that I would like to see in this situation. And this story also highlights sort of like so many of the complications of this, right? So at one point in my session, I was asked, do I want to be held? And my answer was no. And just for more context here, right? This is someone I've worked who's somatically informed, we've had consensual touch many times in ways that were almost before this point, like 100% was spot on, correct? Like, yes, this type of touch feels good and is helpful. This was the first time where in that moment I was like, no, that one doesn't feel right. And for me, it had to do with like, I guess I would perceive like being held as sort of like being in like a parent-child kind of dynamic, right? And I didn't want that kind of nurturing energy in that moment. So that's all fine. This person asked me another time. I don't know how many times they asked me another time or two. I don't remember exactly, but if I wanted to be held, right? And that was where I started to feel something where I was like, you know, and now on top of this whole thing about like confusion of roles and all this stuff, and I started to be like, wait, and to be clear here, I don't think this person was making advances on me or anything. I believe this person was genuinely showing up in service to me to provide that kind of nurturing presence, right? And that's like, I think that is a lot of ways people are trained in some of these schools of thought. And but yeah, there was a part of me that was like, wait a minute, why am I getting asked this again? And like, this feels like I'm being kind of pulled in this certain direction. Who is this coming from? Is this mine? Is this my need? Is this their need? What's going on? So ultimately I did bring this up with the person who was holding the space for me. And they actually, and I want to say, like, this person like really received it well. They listened very deeply. And I want to add here, like, I don't believe there was some egregious thing this person did. I think it was so subtle. It was so subtle because it is more of an art, right? Because you're working with a guide because you want them to guide you. You want people to make you suggestions, right? So there's a dance there, and it's all emergent. So again, it's very nuanced, but it was real. What came up for me. And like I was saying, I appreciate how this person responded, and we talked about it a lot since, and they really created that space. But it was still very hard for me, right? And this is the important thing, right? Like, it's very hard because of that power dynamic. It's hard to talk about something like this, right? Like, I was sitting there thinking, like, well, I don't want to bring this up because I'm just going to get like therapy gaslit or something right now. It's just going to be about like, oh, well, why did you feel this way? Right. And that's important too. We did go into all of that, and it was really important because there is a lot there also to unpack. But I didn't want it to be just about that, though, right? Because I felt there was a valid feedback. I wanted this person to receive it and to respond, and I didn't feel, and I didn't feel like therapy has this kind of mechanism. There isn't a great way for clients to give feedback, and there's a big insight I had in this session. Like, it's not a great mechanism for clients to give feedback to someone who's holding that kind of space for them, and I had to like, and I'm someone who's like done plenty of psychedelics and I talk about it on the internet, right? And I was having difficulty, and I can imagine someone who's got a lot of trauma, like how difficult could that be? And on the moment I was able to, like, as I said, break the fourth wall. And I was able to like hold that and say, all right, I'm going to break this fourth wall and let's talk about this thing. But it's there aren't natural ways to do that. And so one thing this brought up for me, and I'm kind of obviously my situation is not the same as Will's, and I don't want to, I'm not suggesting that, but I think I think I got perspective that's informing how I think about this. And specifically, like, I would like to see those kind of mechanisms, right? I would like to see it be more integrated into psychedelic therapy. How can clients give feedback to therapists in a way where it's like received? How can clients even, how do we rank psychedelic ethics in a way that's not just therapists talking, but like maybe it should be informed by clients? Yeah. The other big thing I'd want to name though, that, it could have been relevant for the situation in this initial article too, is like maybe what needs to happen in psychedelic therapy, if we're gonna, I do think there is a place where consensual touch is important, right? And of course, we had talked about it. It wasn't out of the blue, this offering. It was talked about beforehand. Hey, I might offer you this kind of touch. So that wasn't something that was new. But I think it could go even further. Where it can go even further is, because it feels hard to say no, right? And that's,
for you, it doesn't feel hard for everyone.
Not for everyone, but okay. I think, I said no, and it was fine, but it wasn't, gravity is easy. It's easy. The gravity of it, of a situation is, I think, I don't know, I don't think I'm alone in this, let's say, but it's not as natural to say no sometimes. And I think it could, I don't know, one thing that might be helpful is, before a psychedelic session, like, we're going to do, these are things I might offer. And when I offer you this thing, I want to invite you to check in with yourself and check in. Do I want this? And feel really comfortable. Having a therapist say ahead of time, like, hey, I want you to feel comfortable saying your no, saying your yes, and to really invite that kind of a process. So I don't know, these are just some of my own thoughts and insights, just drawn from my own experience of how we could inform kind of the ethics of consent around in the psychedelic therapy session.
Yeah, there's so much in there. Thank you for sharing your experience. And there's so much in there. And I think that, one of the things that I'm hearing in that is that for me, in an ideal world, if you're doing one-on-one work with someone, then it is a longer relationship. And I think that there's something here about, one of the shadows, I think, of this style of psychedelic underground community or work is I think that there can be a lack of humility at times. And I think that some folks come into the work with such a kind of, either it's naive or it's like grandiose or somewhere in the middle, like idea that, the medicine will heal, and I think that can lead people to working with people really fast, a really high dose, without doing the work necessary to actually create a solid, safe container in a way that isn't really trauma informed. And I think that can also lead people to bring their interventions over from someone who's maybe, doing like consciousness exploring, or like has the same gender and age as them, and so there's the same power, or like, I think that there can be, and again, I know a lot of practitioners who are incredible and nuanced and wise and brilliant and who are thinking deeply about this. And I think that there also can be a shadow of this work where people aren't taking that time to really be like, this is a meaningful place that you're allowing me into, to take you into a really expanded state. And I know that you're really trusting me and I'm taking it really seriously. I think that some people can be like, they're struggling, just give them 5 grams of mushrooms and the mushrooms will work it out. Right. Which okay, sure, maybe that'll work for some people. But I think that, there can be a lack of humility in the work. And I think that it's interesting when you talk about these mechanisms for feedback, because I know that in some evidence-based modalities of above-board therapy, you give feedback at the end of every session. What worked? What did I like? Did I feel missed? Like, when did I feel held? But I don't know how that would work in a more relational or psychodynamic form of therapy, where people really are working out their stuff with their therapist. And I think that one of the things that you're signing up for when you become a psychedelic guide in this way is to be a blank slate for projection, as much as you're also being a human with that person. And so that brings the question then, how do you discern between when someone is like really deeply projecting their thing onto you that they need you to hold for them so that they can work through this thing. Like, they're mad at you and they need you to, like, hold that they're mad at you, and you know it has nothing to do with you, and in a little bit they'll know that it has nothing to do with you, but right now they need you to hold that. How do you discern between when that is happening and when there's actually some feedback that you need to take in? And it's really hard. Sometimes it's actually probably not hard at all. Sometimes it's probably extremely easy to discern that, but I can imagine, and you know, some situations that I've been in, that colleagues have been in, it can be hard to tell, because it can be hard for the client to tell. And especially when so many of us spend so much of our time in a non-expanded state, walking around, projecting our shit onto people, and also being really validly harmed and impacted by people. And I think it can be hard in a non-expanded state to tell the difference between those things. And I think it can be very hard in an expanded state. And so if you're doing this type of relational therapy with someone where you're really holding something for them, I'm not saying that this isn't I think there should be mechanisms for feedback. I think that, you know, the really brilliant people who are working on these psychedelic ethics boards, or forming these types of agreements, I think that they are considering this, and I hope that they're considering, like, how do we have clients inform the work? And I just am noticing and wanting to raise, like, it's complicated when you're actually working with people psychologically and helping them dive into their unconscious, where there's stuff that they don't know about, you don't know about. Like, we are all really, like, humbled at the feet of the unconscious. And so how to work with that, I think, is a question. And
that's the thing, it's really, it gets into a lot of really murky territory here, because we're exploring aspects of psyche, and but I think something you said I want to echo a little bit is, like, that humility around it. And this is where it's delicate, right? Because you're working with a guide. Right. Why are you working with a guide? You want someone to guide you. Right. And
you are the expert in yourself, and, like, you are a sovereign being. Yeah,
exactly. For sure. And so where is that balance? Because to some extent you want a guide to sort of suggest things, but at what point, where does it become something that's not okay anymore? Of course, there's obvious places where that can be, where someone says, hey, I don't want this. Okay. But and it's, I guess what I'd name also is, I don't know, this is stuff that's being worked out. Like, we're doing it live, like, you know, things are happening, and, you know, the conversation in our broader culture around all of these things is still honestly in its infancy. Like, you know, when I was in middle school and I had sex ed, we didn't have, like, consent class. Right. Why not? What was up with that? Right. So, like, the conversations we have today, we have a lot more conversations today about consent than we had 30 years ago. You know, and this, of course, that doesn't excuse anything. That's not to say, like, oh, your cultural context 30 years ago, like, was different, so it's not your fault. But I don't know. I think there's something, for me, it's helpful to understand where there are blind spots and where there could have been, where there have been blind spots and where there still are. Is to think about where we are. And even, like, this, it's very new that we are talking about psychedelic therapy in this open way, much less psychedelic therapy ethics. So there's so much stuff that we are still, like, we're really working out, and we're figuring out, like, oh, where are the you know, other things too I would think of is you know, maybe I think Will seemed to suggest in his story that he didn't feel like he should have gotten psychedelics in the first place, and maybe if he was someone today, it wouldn't have. But that was a thing that's been a learning, you know, who should get this, who shouldn't.
Totally. There's something that I want to just touch on that you said, that is something about the humility, and something about like, we're just working this out live. And there's something that I want to name here about the challenge, and also just the kind of devastating inadequacy that comes with working as part of a criminalized workforce. And, like, you and I are doing this live, you and I are doing this here. People maybe aren't able to tell from our voices, but maybe they can, like, and you and I are both, like, you're in your 30s, right?
Yes.
You and I are both in our
35 on Tuesday.
Happy birthday. You and I are both in our 30s. We're both white. We're both speaking from a place where psychedelics are decriminalized. And I can't help but feel like I'm sure there is so much wisdom out there from people who cannot speak as, and I'm using a fake name, but who like have not historically and still can't speak as freely about this. And because of the criminalized aspect of it, and because people hold identities that are more likely to be incarcerated, hassled by the police, like have someone listen into this and then try and demonize them because they're their neighbor and it's a racist neighbor, and so I also just really want to name that I feel so sure that there's real, not that we have the answers, because if we did, we'd be doing it, but like there's so much wisdom out there in communities that have been policed out of speaking openly about this type of thing. And I just want to name that is so sad and so unfortunate. And I hope that all of us who care about this are putting some of our effort towards making this safe and accessible for all people who have these decades and generations of wisdom to share with us.
Yeah. It's another example, right, of where suppressing something makes it more dangerous. And this is something the harm reduction community talks about a lot. Like, it's prohibition that makes drugs dangerous. It's not the drugs, right? And I think that actually shows up in this story. How the very fact of what was happening, of it being illegal, is part of how a lot of the harm happened. Because some of the, there was the initial thing that and I try to give my understanding of it, of where there were consent wasn't necessarily followed, right? But then it was the response,
right?
And that's my sense I got from the story, was that it was Will didn't feel like, came and said, hey, look, I felt this happen, and it was sort of, that wasn't received, and this that piece of it maybe is separate from the legality, but there was an aspect there where it wasn't really received, right? And this is something I heard, I'm going to circle back to the legal thing, but this is something I heard expressed by many people in the community, that they were, the thing that many people felt in this situation was feeling like it wasn't being modeled like what we want our how we want our leaders to respond, right, when something comes up, and that's real, and where this connects in to the legality, though, is I think that's part of the reason why we're not able to do as much of a restorative and transformative process here. Because, a part of the story was, there was this part that happened 20 years ago where, Will said, hey, and I don't know, maybe there's different versions of the story, but my understanding was like, he said, hey, I want this $20,000 or I'm going to call the police on you.
Right.
And so they paid him $20,000. If now in present day, the same person's coming back, it's not surprising to me, right, that now it's a lawyered up response. Like, I can, again, this isn't to like, say, this isn't to defend any kind of thing. There's still accountability in the initial aspect of this whole
and maybe
situation.
Probably there's validity in Will asking for that money. Like, I have no idea.
Right. But just to say, like, I also understand why there's a lawyered response in the current moment, and the fact of there being the criminalization of this space is alive, and it's part of how it's really preventing us from having, really as open of a dialogue around this as we might be able to. It really is, just another example of, another example of harms of drug war.
Another example of the harms of the drug war.
Yeah. But it affects our ability to actually do real accountability, I think.
Totally.
I would like to see, like more of I'm not an expert in restorative and transformative justice, but I would like, that's what my idea would be. And I'll quick shout out here. Rebecca Martinez wrote a great article in Psychedelics Today that she linked to in the ethics channel. It's pinned there. Definitely recommend reading that, because that's a beautiful look into kind of alternatives that we could imagine. But there's a lot of barriers to it,
There's a lot of barriers to it. And I also want to jumping around, but I do
Yeah.
want to circle back to the thing that before I took us off tangent.
Yeah.
Which is just really quick, which is I think that, this lack of humility piece around working with anyone, I think that it's true that currently under current contemporary standards of care, my understanding is that Will identifies as someone who is a survivor of a schizophrenia diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that would make him ineligible for
Right.
psychedelic work
Right.
with most providers that I know. And so I do think that especially back then, I don't think that it's totally eradicated now. I think that there's definitely a continued lack of humility now. But I do think that, people have had a blind faith in just giving people drugs
Mm-hmm.
and calling it medicine, which, that too. It is that too.
Yeah.
And thinking that it'll work for everyone in a way that really has not been trauma-informed, has not been informed by the way that people experience the world, and has not been totally consensual, has not really been, when I work with people, I ask them if it would be okay if things get worse before it gets better. And for some people it would not be okay. And I think and this is also part of how I learned not to work with people in crisis. You work with people who are stable. And this is also true for many forms of depth and imaginal psychotherapy where we're delving into the unconscious. If someone doesn't have a strong enough ego structure to make it through the day, they don't have a strong enough ego structure to even do dream work. For people who are really, really skilled in this type of, I understand expanded states to be a lot of things. That psychedelics is one thing, but for people who are really skilled in inducing expanded states without psychedelics, you want someone to have a strong enough ego structure to go there. And I think that and that lack of humility in the psychedelic space, I think, opens people who are not stable enough and don't have support enough, which is when we also, also when I think about people who don't have support enough, one of the things that I have a lot of conversations with people around is about increasing access to the work and how to increase access to the work for people who don't have financial resources, housing resources, the ability to actually have a stable place. Because if you don't have stable and safe enough life, it's really, I think, ethically irresponsible to open someone's mind and psyche up to anything that might be there, to blast them open and then send them home somewhere unsafe. And so this is a little bit tangential, but it also kind of, I think, is just really important, something that I think about a lot, where it's how are we increasing access, and how are we making it so that when we think about how stable someone is, we're thinking about all the different aspects of it.
Yeah. And something that, this is a little bit tangential here, but something that is coming up for me as you were saying this. I'm just thinking about this relationship between the personal and the systemic.
Yeah.
And that's something that's, this is a whole bunch of nuance here. Let's get into it, right? What is the relationship between the personal and the systemic? And I think one thing what we've been hitting on in this conversation too is personal accountability for when harm is caused is really important, number one, right? So we can talk about systemic issues. Of course, while we're talking about systemic issues, that's not to say, oh, it's okay, they were just part of this culture. And at the same time, let's also bear in mind that when harm is caused, we don't want to just scapegoat it onto one person. Totally. When we also are aware that they're part of a broader system. And so it's kind of both. So while holding on to the personal accountability aspects, let's also look at the systems and the cultures that we're in, and say, hey, how are we all complicit in this?
Which is so painful for people. I was with a group of practitioners. I have been, since this came out, I've been in lots of conversations with lots of groups of practitioners. And one group of practitioners that I was with, there was this person who another guide and I were trying to say to this person, who was an older man, and the other guide who I was talking with was another kind of younger femme presenting person. And we were just kind of communicating experience of reality that includes that this happens in the guiding community. Like, this is a systemic issue. This is an issue in how we're trained. This is an issue in how accountability is held. Like, there is harm being caused. This is not just our own 25 years ago. This is a thing. And this person that we were talking to was like, could not believe us. Like, they were just like, how do you know this is systemic? Show me the numbers, show me the percentage, show me the whatever. And I could feel that came from this deep place of devastation where they're like, no, like, I cannot tolerate this being a part of this thing that I care about so deeply, a part of this community that I've put so much of my identity into, like, and how to hold both of those things where it's like, it is devastating for people, particularly in this culture where we are so acculturated into, honestly, carceral ways of thinking, where we just put people in boxes and throw away the key and pretend that that's something that is okay and pretend that that's something that any human deserves. And we're so acculturated to that the idea that actually it's people we love among us who are causing harm and that they are not different from us is hard. It's really hard for people. And it's really important.
Well, it's easier. It's much easier to like look at the situation as like, okay, like when someone causes harm, that must mean they're a villain. And I think it's much more useful though and important to humanize people who cause harm, right? We all cause harm, and so what does that really look? And then again, humanizing someone who causes harm doesn't mean you don't have accountability. You can do both at the same time. You can hold somebody accountable, and in this case, like I think there's real accountability here, and there's lessons for sure for Aaron, and it seems there's already been consequences. He's no longer, as I understand it, teaching with the Center for Consciousness Medicine. May or may not be other things too. I don't know, but there's things there, and I think we can't just look at this situation like, look at it like, okay, here's this person there's two reasons why there's the bad one. There's the bad one over there, and we're just gonna remove this person from the community, and that's our solution. And that's sort of is chopping us off at the knees from actually engaging with a much more difficult conversation. And not only that, like, I think, and I'll bring up something I had a conversation. I have a number of conversations about this, but one of the times I was talking about this, I expressed to somebody my perspective that I do believe, and I don't really know Aharon, right? But I do believe that he was trying to provide nurturing touch in this scenario. And I said this, and someone felt very triggered by me saying that this was how I perceived the situation. And so like, well, how do you know that? How do you know they weren't actually making a sexual advance on them? And of course I don't know, right? I don't know the answer to this. I wasn't in the room. I don't know it's there. But to me, this, I think this is interesting though, right? It's almost like, I guess this comes back to what we're saying. It's kind of easier if we want to believe that this was someone who was, knowingly, willingly causing harm. But I think it's, if we actually hold this, that like, hey, here's someone who really was trying to do something helpful and fucked up in an important and major way, like, that there's something really useful to engaging with that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I was with another group of practitioners, which there's just been so much wisdom flowing from the psychedelic community in the conversations that I've been having. And yeah, that impulse to be like, oh, well, there's the bad one that we need to get away from, or here's the innocent one who we need to pull close and protect from the bad ones who are accusing them. Like that type of kind of like polarizing binary thinking. Also is just kind of the opposite of what it could be to bring psychedelic consciousness into this conversation, where it's like the answer is always it's more complicated than that, that we, like the answer is always that we are in service to the unfolding truth of the moment, and our desire to be in control of it is foolish.
Yeah. And there's a desire. Sorry, we're gonna.
Well, But one of the things that someone said that, and I think that the desire to push away the one who caused harm, it also, maybe a different way to say it is like, how different would it be if we had somehow a culture that was so aware of the multiplicity of experience that when we see someone causing harm, we're able to be like, oh, you need help. Like, there's something wrong. You know, like, if someone's consistently misattuning to their clients and violating them, like, are you okay?
Right.
And in conversations that I've been in with guides over the past couple of weeks, I've been hearing so much this desire, especially from younger and newer guides, to be like, hey, beloved community, like, if you see me doing something weird, I'm counting on you because I have blind spots, and I, as we all do, am going to miss my clients and I'm going to miss my community. And how can I feel trusting enough to be able to bring forward when this happens and be like, hey, I'm not sure what it is, but there's something off with me right now and I need help. Right. Instead of, as I'm sure most people feel, coming forward and being like, hey, there's something off. And because we have such an internalized carceral system and prison system and like ideas of what good and bad is, you know, how many people would come forward except they're afraid that if they come forward and say something like, hey, I want to have sex with my client, people are going to be like, oh my God, you're so bad. Get away from me. I don't want to be associated with you predator. You know? So it's actually that like we are creating this reality where people who have these totally normal human blind spots and impulses and you know, and I know that Aharon and Francois in that statement were being deeply guided by their lawyers, but I think that there's something, you know, again, there in a lack of humility or in a defensiveness or something, there's a reason that comes up, and it's because people feel that they will be attacked and judged and sent away forever and put in a prison or something if they admit to have done something wrong. And how can we shift that cultural norm to being like, please bring forward your shadow, please bring forward the weird thing that you did in that session that you're not actually sure what that impulse was, so that we can learn from each other and so that we can hold each other to the standard that we know is possible, but that is only possible if we are holding each other to it together. It is actually, because humans have blind spot, it is impossible to hold ourselves to that standard. Like, we just can't. Right.
And this is, it's kind of like the tragic, ironic thing about all of this, right? I mean, at the end of the day, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to make there be less harm in the world, right?
Yeah, and like, you know, I think that for me it's like when we try to make there be less harm, that is even part of the kind of ideological thinking that makes us push it away.
Okay, thank you.
Because to me, there being less harm is a side effect of how can we expand our own capacity to be with reality and to be with ourselves and to be with our community and beloved people in what is hard and in what is disappointing. And how can we have kind of less of an individualistic standard of perfection and more of a community standard of like, there is a net big enough to catch each other. And I think that if there is a net big enough to catch each other, the natural impact of that is that there will be less harm, because people won't feel like they have to hide their harm. People won't feel like, people won't you know, have it happen over and over and over and over and over again because they don't tell anyone that something feels a little bit off, and then suddenly there's an article or a blog post or whatever, which happens for every teacher ever of like any school that I've ever been in. And then suddenly there's 200 people that are like, oh yeah, that me too. Right. Like, how do we make it so that the first time people themselves are able to be like, I think I did something weird and I think I need help. And I know that I can go to my community and be supported in figuring out what's going on. Like, to me, that's the thing that causes less harm, not the desire to stop harm.
That's really good. Can we make it, I mean, I don't know if this is, it's like, can we make it possible for people to like own their fuck ups better?
Yeah, totally. And also to like own their fuck ups, like be an unfolding mess of a practitioner. Be imperfect and like, yeah, like be imperfect but striving. I'm gonna, this is like a little bit tangential, but I think is really important, or is maybe helpful. I think I was thinking about saying this at the beginning and I forgot. There's a person named Jerika Blackman, who is a reverend and a like race and diversity teacher here in Oakland, who's amazing. I don't have a personal relationship with her, which is why I'm naming her name, but she has a framework for racial justice that she teaches people, or how to be anti-racist, that I think is really helpful. It's so simple. It's brave, humble, dedicated. And to me, that is applicable to anti-racism. It's applicable to just how to be a person. And it feels very applicable here, where it's like, can I be, because being a space holder takes courage, you know, like it takes putting yourself, to do it in a vulnerable way that really is kind of holding the tender sacredness of what is being trusted to you. And it's like, can you be brave enough to offer that? Can you be brave enough to offer an intervention? Can you be brave enough to put yourself out there? Can you be brave enough to, you know, do any of the internal work it takes to come into a position of power? Can you be humble enough to receive that feedback? Can you be humble enough to know that just because you're in a position of power does not mean that you are better than the person you're holding space for, or somehow more wise than them, or more wise than anyone? And can you be dedicated enough to the process and to yourself and to your client to not let falling or wiggling off your seat or off your whatever make it so that then you're like, oh, well, I'm just gonna go, you know? Like, can we be a little less self-indulgent about our space holding, and a little less self-indulgent about our roles, and a little more, and again, just coming back to humility, like how can we be really humble to the fact that we are imperfect humans that can also do miraculous things? And this is, again, where the psychedelic consciousness comes in. Like, can we hold both of those at once? That we are both like incredibly powerful, miraculous beings, and are totally gonna fuck up and like do hard things and do something weird and misattune, and how to just like have a strong enough core to be able to return to that place of power that those of us who have chosen to be in space holding roles have chosen into. We've chosen power, and with that comes a degree of sacrifice that's required.
Yeah.
How are you doing on time?
Well, it's we're getting close to the 90-minute mark over here, and I guess we have some choice. We could potentially bring some questions on. What I'll also say is that we have a community voice channel where people can afterwards, and maybe that might be more appropriate, just have people speak with each other, so it's not just listening to like us talk. We're just kind of maybe seeding conversation. So maybe what we'll do is we'll take a couple more minutes here, to just kind of wrap up some of the thoughts we've been talking about, and then after that we'll invite the community to hop into the community voice channel here in Discord and to collectively kind of talk through other things that are coming up, and that will be a non-recorded room. And so and in that room, of course, maintain confidentiality of what's shared in there. That will be a space that's for everyone to feel safe in, sharing rough drafts of their own reflections. And then, of course, the whole server is just evergreen, so you can keep engaging. But yeah, so with that note, like, yeah, are there, as a final kind of thread to this, are there points, is there anything that we missed that we want to, like...
I feel like I've hit everything that felt really important to me.
You know, one thing I'd be interested to speak about. You hit it a little bit, but I want to maybe go deeper into this idea about attunement. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting idea, right? You know, it's like attunement isn't something that you can put into a set of procedures.
Totally.
You can't say like, if this, then that. This is the rules. This is what you can do. This is what you can't do. This is when. It's emergent, organic. It's intuitive. Yeah. It's messy.
It's relational.
I don't know. I'd love to hear you talk about attunement, actually.
Sure. I mean, it is all of those things that you said, and I also think that it is, you know, I really I'm just going to be repeating my my own talking points, which is, yeah, I mean, attunement in a therapeutic container really requires this balance of, you know, so much of it is skill that you can learn. It's like, how do you mirror? How do you do this thing? How do you do this thing? How do you, there's even like, you know, how do you heighten the emotion in a session by pitching your voice and like doing the and then like there's this artistry to space holding that is an art in many ways. And it also requires, like, really attuning to another person requires that type of humility of how do you make yourself less important and actually turn your energetic reflection and attention and your deep listening to someone into a container in and of itself. And I think that is almost, you know, and it's interesting, like there are, of course, like really incredible teachers and space holders who their level of attunement and the mastery of it is part of what compels people to them, like their ability to really get someone's experience, really let someone feel seen. And then on the other end of that, and I think in the realm where you know, again, the shadow of not just psychedelic therapy, but the shadow of many types of Western psychotherapy that places the practitioner consciously places the practitioner above the patient or the client, it turns that space holder into an expert, which makes it much less important to attune to someone. It makes it much more of a, you know, self-important, aggrandizing experience of like, I'm gonna heal you, or you're gonna tell me about your trauma and I'm gonna like figure you out, turning people into like an intellectual experiment more than a kind of like attachment oriented human being in front of them. Yeah, and I don't know, you know, I hope that I can at some point be as masterful an attuner as some people that I've seen, but I think that, you know, the thing that feels important to me about that as well is also just this thing of like, for me, if I reach a place in my practice where I'm like, I am getting a lot of feedback that I'm not attuning to my clients, like I just pray that I can be held in a community of practice with people who can help me with that. Because if that is going wrong with a high degree of frequency, then there's something wrong for me with the way that I'm practicing. There's something that needs tending to inside of me that I hope that I would get support by. Yeah. And I think that that's an important indicator. And I think if we can orient towards that from that place more, where we're like, if something is feeling off a lot of the time, then like, how can we let that inform us that we need some help, and how can we have good help to get? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks. Yeah, that's pretty good. Maybe before we give some closing notes here, I'll make a quick maybe logistical thing here. If you liked this conversation, you want to see more of it, you can support us on Patreon. patreon.com/psychsems. PSYCHSEMS. We're going to do more of these nuanced conversations.
By we, Mike doesn't mean me, just so people know.
I intend to do more of these kind of conversations, more nuanced conversations, and offer them to the community. So if you feel like this is something that you'd like to support, we would gratefully appreciate that. And on that note, though, as far as this conversation goes, I deeply appreciate you for being here, for being vulnerable in yourself, for showing up, for sharing this. This is not an easy conversation to have. Definitely, I mean, like, I felt things, and I'm sure you have too. So thank you for doing this. I think this has been a really helpful. I hope it was. We'll have to see. I haven't read the feedback yet. I know. But we're gonna continue this. We want everyone to engage. We're gonna, after this closes out, be in the community voice channel for everyone to chat with each other. Did you have anything you wanted to like share before we? I
think that in final closing, I just want to kind of again I'm glancing at the list of people who are listening, and I just want to name my awareness that there's really brilliant, insightful, wise guides and practitioners and community members who are even just listening right now. And I maybe just want to say, like, what a blessing it is to be in community with such incredible wisdom, and that I don't take that for granted. And my hope is that we can all find a way to actually be engaging with each other from that place of deep wisdom, because I do believe that if we're able to kind of regulate our nervous systems and expand our capacity to be with reality, which is so much of what journeying is, that there's something incredible that could happen. And yeah, and so maybe I just want to say thank you to everyone who's listening. And I know that even the folks that I don't know, that there's so much wisdom and brilliance there. And I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Yeah, and I want to echo that. I know there's a lot of deep wisdom and brilliance that's currently in the audience, but we're all going to be talking together. And if there's any intention I have around this, it's really to help, have there be a space for this conversation to happen. And that's why this platform is really nice, because like it allows for the whole community. This isn't just like a one-way thing, like, oh, here, like, I don't have the answers. I'm a person. I'm struggling to, we're all trying to figure this out. But I think if we can figure this out together. And so, yeah, I really want to invite that. I want to echo that and invite that in. I want to invite everyone who's here today. If you're listening to this, you care and you have perspective, and you're invited to really share that. And, you have permission to share that, if nothing else. So yeah, thanks everyone for tuning into this. We're going to hop over to the community voice channel so everyone can kind of chat together. So see you over there. Thanks, and
thanks everyone.
May the force be with you.